The election of 1932 was coming up soon, and facing off against Herbert Hoover was a wealthy New Yorker that was, of course, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Has a very famous last name because he was distantly related to Theodore Roosevelt. And like Theodore Roosevelt, he had also started his career as an assistant secretary to the Navy. And eventually he got his career even bigger in 1920 when he was nominated as a vice presidential candidate for the Democrats and didn't win. But eventually he did get polio, and polio is a debilitating and very deadly disease that kind of strikes your muscles and doesn't allow you to have strength in a lot of different areas. But what he needed is, in order to even stand up at all, he needed these painful steel leg braces. And so for the rest of his life, that's how he did it. But he didn't want to show any weakness or sickliness because he wanted to be the president. And so he never once let his picture get taken in his wheelchair because he was determined to always look strong. Eventually, he won and became the New York governor in 1928, and 4 years later, he was nominated to run as the Democratic candidate against Herbert Hoover in 1932, and he absolutely destroyed Hoover in the election. He won with 472 electoral votes, and Hoover only got 59. And his confidence in what he could do and how he wanted to change the depression and fix it is what was really encouraging and appealing to people. So the day after Franklin Delano Roosevelt took office, he declared a bank holiday, and he said that the banks were going to close for 4 days. And the idea was to try and stop these bank failures, like we've talked about before, those runs on the banks that end up making the banks fail and fall apart because people panic and want their money out. Okay, and so he was trying to stop these bank failures, and so while these 4 days were happening, he started to propose the Emergency Banking Relief Act. And that was basically an act that said the government's going to watch over and try and protect these banks a little more and protect the people from bad practices by these banks, make sure the banks are doing the right thing. And then he had during these 4 days, one of his first fireside chats, he called them. And a fireside chat, his idea was he wanted you to feel like he just sitting next to the fireplace with him, and he was talking to you about the issues of the country and trying to assure you that things were going well. And so, but what he actually did is he had radio stations broadcast it so that he could be in your living room because everybody had a radio. And so he had these radio talks where he would talk with the nation and tell them what the plan was and what they needed to do to make the country better. And he said in his very first one that it's much safer to put your money in the banks than it is under your mattress. It's not safe under your mattress. It can't grow interest, anything like that. And so when those banks opened again, a relieved public started to bring their savings back in instead of running in and taking it out and making the banks fail themselves. FDR put together a group of college professors and other people to help him out, and he called them his brain trust. And they very quickly started to come up with ideas. And over his first 100 days in office, he made 15 new bills, which was a record for the most bills ever up to that time. And these bills and a lot of the things that he did were called the New Deal. And they were called the New Deal because he had said that he wanted a new deal for the American people. He wanted to be able to fix all the problems that were happening before. And so the goals of the New Deal were to help have relief for the jobless, help the unemployed. Okay, that's number one. Number two, to recover the economy, make it better. And then number three is to fix it so that we don't have any more depressions later on. Now, each one of these has their own slide, so there will be more information coming up. Now, while FDR's his organizations and things like that were called the New Deal. His organizations were also called alphabet soup organizations. And they were called alphabet soup organizations because they all had these long names, but they had acronyms that were 3 or 4 letters each. And so as you're going through this, you need to understand each of the agencies and associations, all that kind of stuff. You need to understand their entire name as well as their acronym, the short 4 or 3-letter code that goes with them. And so the first goal, if you remember, was to relief for the jobless, which means helping the unemployed. Okay, and so there were 3 of his alphabet soup organizations that helped this, and the other ones did too, but these were the ones where that was the main goal. And the first one was the Federal Emergency Relief Association, or FERA. And FERA gave money to the states, and what that money was supposed to do was to help reopen these relief agencies, these things that help people, but they had been closed because there was no money to help people anymore. And so the federal government started to help out the states in this way. The second thing that he started was the Civilian Conservation Corps, or the CCC. And the CCC, they hired people from the cities who didn't have jobs because there wasn't work in the cities, and they took them out into the parks, into the countrysides and the national parks, all that kind of stuff, and had them work there. And millions of men left from the cities and went out to the country and started to plant trees and build reservoirs and build parks. And so now not only were they helping to make nature great and make our country look better and all that kind of stuff, but they were also out making money and able to spend money again, which is good for the economy. And the last one is the Works Progress Administration. The Works Progress Administration was a group that paid workers to do a lot of work on public building and roads, but with the WPA, it was really big, or it was a lot of projects. It was a whole lot of projects. And so they ended up paving like 650,000 miles of road and 75,000 bridges and building 800 airports. And they hired artists to make murals, and they hired writers to have make stories and state guides and histories and things like that. And so there was a WPA project in every county by the time it was all done with in America. The next goal was to promote economic recovery, and where they really needed to recover and make themselves better were in the agriculture industry, so farming, and the industry, which is like factories and things like that. And so some things that tried to help that out there were, first off, the NRA, which is the National Recovery Administration, not the rifle one that wants guns, but a different NRA. And their goal was, there had been companies who at the very end, when they were going out of business and stuff, they slashed their prices, and it hurt other companies, and it just kind of hurt the entire industries. And so they wanted to keep the prices where they should be and stable, and also try to help out employment and helping people be employed and help the people that are employed make enough money, have a living wage. And so many companies agreed with the NRA that they should have a minimum wage for most of the major industries, that they should stop hiring children, and that they should try and keep the prices from getting too low where it was going to drive everyone out of business. But what a lot of the critics said, this only really helped big businesses. It didn't help the economy, and so they thought it kind of only favored businesses and wasn't for the regular people. Now, the other thing that helped to promote a recovery was the PWA and the Public Works Administration. They did the same thing as the WPA, which makes it kind of confusing, but the PWA, they made really, really big projects. And so they spent over $3 billion on these projects to help infrastructure and also to give people jobs to work on it. And so they made the Lincoln Tunnel in New York, and they made the Key West Highway and the Grand Coulee Dam, these very, very huge projects. Okay. And so the PWA worked on those types of things. The Tennessee Valley Authority also had big projects, but all of their projects were dams that they built along the Tennessee River. And these were pretty successful projects because they wanted to do 3 things, and they did all of them: to control the flooding that happened, to create cheap electricity for the people out there, and a lot of farms that had never had electricity before all of a sudden had them in Tennessee because of this, and to increase the jobs. And of course, every man out there building a dam was a man that had a job. The third role or goal was to fix the problems and avoid any future depressions. And so they did that in a few different ways. First off, they created the FDIC, and the FDIC is the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation was something that was really needed because what it did is whatever money you had in the bank, it would protect it. So even if the bank went out of business, didn't have any money left, the government would protect your money and pay you back that money that you had in savings. And at that time, it guaranteed any of your deposits all the way up to $2,500. And so it did quite a bit of money. And what that did is that entirely eliminated the fear of future bank failures. Now, right now, $2,500 isn't that much, and so it wouldn't work right now. So what they've done is they bumped the amount of money up throughout the years, and right now every depositor is insured all the way up to $250,000. So your first $250,000 in the bank are insured even if that bank completely fails and goes out of business. Now, the other thing that happened is there was more safety in industries. They started to want the people to be safer as well as the workers to be safer, so the people buying and the people making it. And so one of these groups that was created was the Federal Power Commission, and they were set up to make safety and rules and things like that for the oil and gas industries. And then it made the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, a lot more powerful, which improved improved people's food and medicine, making it safer and healthier. There were some people that really didn't like the New Deal for a number of different reasons, and one of those groups that didn't like some of the stuff was the Supreme Court of the United States. And what they said is that some of the things that the president was doing at this point were unconstitutional. He wasn't allowed to do it. It didn't fit with the Constitution. One of those things was the NRA, and then also there were other things as well. And what they were saying is that the government was taking on too much power. They were getting too much power out of it. Okay, and FDR at this point was upset about that, and he said to Congress, he said, I would like to add 6 extra judges to the Supreme Court. So instead of having 9, we would have 15 judges in the Supreme Court. And he said, those judges are just overworked. They're working too hard, and so I want it. Well, of course, Congress said no because of the Supreme Court, and everybody realized that he was trying to do a court packing scheme. And court packing means that he was trying to fill it up with judges that liked his ideas, and so that they would listen to him and only agree with him. Now, eventually, being in office for a really long time, as we're going to learn later, FDR would end up naming 8 of the 9 justices that were on the Supreme Court. All right, so the next person that we're going to talk about is this man over to the left on this picture, or the left picture here, and that is Huey Long. Huey Long thought of a great idea that he could end the Depression right now. He thought FDR isn't doing enough, and he said if we do high taxes on the rich and we take that money and we give it to the poor, we spread that money to everybody else, then it will end the Depression right now, and that was called the Share the Wealth Plan. A lot of people got excited about that. And then this man, Francis Townsend, had a really good idea. And his good idea was that he thought the government should pay retirement. So when you get too old to work, once you hit 60 years old, the government should give you $200 a month until you die. And what that would do is the people after 60 would quit working because they'd have enough money to quit working, and then other people could take their jobs. We'd have less of the unemployment. And the thing is, this did not get approved, but it did set the stage for Social Security, and so that was a good thing that we're going to talk about later on. Even with all those challenges of the New Deal, in 1936, FDR was just too popular to be defeated and became the president again. Now, again, into the Depression, what were the issues that women were dealing with in the Depression? And some of the issues that they had was, first off, their jobs. There was a couple of really good advantages that women had in their jobs. A lot of them were working as clerks and secretaries, so the person at the store who checks you out, and then secretaries And there was not much competition in those jobs. Men were not trying to get into those jobs. And a lot of those jobs were not being lost. More of the factory type jobs were closing rather than the office type. So there was more job security. However, the ones that weren't working in that situation were um, were losing their jobs because out of work men would come back and try and take jobs as teachers and library workers, and then any of the women that work in factories were the first ones to be fired as well. And the other thing is a lot of people were working in domestic type situations, which meaning they were being maids or housekeepers or sewing or whatever else kind of thing would needed to be done in people's houses, and people couldn't afford that anymore. They had to start cleaning their own houses and things like that. And so that really hurt women's employment. And so even if they didn't stop working at the factories and in these other areas, the women had to go back to work at home because they couldn't afford to buy items. And so now they had to start again making clothes, canning vegetables, baking bread instead of buying those things. Eleanor Roosevelt was a very important woman's figure and one of the most powerful and influential first ladies of all time. She was FDR's wife, and she was the first lady that, because he had polio and couldn't move or travel around and stuff like that, she would go around all these places and she would be the president's eyes and tell him what she saw, and his ears and tell him what she heard, and his voice and kind of speak for him as well. And so she had a lot of power, and one of the main things she worked for with her power was women's rights. And so creating like situations where she would have press conferences with only female reporters, and she would encourage FDR to give more women these high ranking government positions. African Americans in the Depression, they started to have to leave in the South, to leave their sharecropping jobs because the cotton prices were down and they were losing too much money. And they went into these cities and they saw that there was all kinds of unemployment. And then so for these African Americans, there was more unemployment, more illness, more hunger even than before. And so these traditional black jobs that were not jobs that people wanted to do, like cleaning the streets and stuff like that, were now being filled by unemployed white people who before would have never imagined doing a job like that. And so also the African Americans were usually the last people to be hired onto a job, and they would wait until they had hired as many white people as they could, and they would be the first ones to be fired if they had to fire someone. And so by 1932, half of the African Americans in the South were unemployed. Now FDR, he had a mixed record on it. He gave some more rights to African Americans and helped them out, but he also didn't vote for some things that would have given them even more rights. But he did put a group of high-ranking black appointees that advised him on African American issues, and that's all they were there to advise him on, and they were called the Black Cabinet. And because of Eleanor's encouraging, he also put on about 100 African Americans into government posts of different types. And so the real big, strong advocate for African American rights and all the minorities, the women, African Americans, all that kind of stuff, was Eleanor Roosevelt. She was the one that cared more about that kind of things. And so she kind of encouraged and asked her husband to do many, many things to help minorities. Immigrants were coming at this time too, and when the Mexican immigrants were coming in, when times were good, they were migrant workers coming in, and they were welcome. People wanted them around because they would travel from farm to farm and pick crops for very little money, and so the farmers liked that. But then when times were tough and all the jobs were really hard to get and anybody would be happy to be a migrant worker, they wanted those Mexican immigrants out. And so the United States ended up deporting about tens of thousands of Mexicans. Some of them actually were even American citizens that were deported and asked to leave. Now, John Collier also worked with other groups of minorities, and he worked with Native Americans, and so you can see him right up here. But he was put into the position of Commissioner of Indian Affairs by FDR, and he really worked towards giving the Indians more freedom and more power. And so he created what he called the Indian New Deal. The other thing that he did is he put them to work. He got them jobs by putting them work on public projects, public works projects. And so they built like really much needed schools and hospitals and irrigation systems to water their crops. And the farms were hurt by even more because in the year 1930, very little rain fell out in the plains. And this drought that happened ended up causing some bad things to happen in the farmlands of the United States, especially Oklahoma and some of those states. And so it caused 5 years of these huge dust storms happening. Okay. And it ended up covering and ruining like 100 million acres of farmland, covering this great farmland with great soil in this dust that nothing could grow in. And the reason that this happened is because there were these giant strips of land that used to have sod in them, what we talked about before, sod, these grasses that kept the dirt down on the ground. But when you remove that, now the dirt's just loose, just laying there, and if the wind comes across, it can pick that dirt up and take it away to somewhere else. So that sod was really needed. And so these fast acting dust storms would come up, and people called them black blizzards because they could turn bright day into what seemed like midnight, and it got dark, and they would bury fences, and they would seep, this dust and dirt would seep into houses, and it could kill animals and people by burying them or suffocating them or things like that. Okay. And so it was a nasty place to be, where your house, like these pictures show, could just be destroyed and buried by this dust. And so the people started to go away, and a lot of families started to leave these ruined farms and head to California to try and get better off. And a lot of them came from Oklahoma, and the Californians didn't like them very much, and so they called them Okies and kind of called them like they were not as smart as them and all that kind of stuff. And a lot of them came out and found that California wasn't much better off, and they had to pick crops and get paid barely enough money to stay alive, where they were still starving, even though they were working super hard. The Social Security Act was also put together to help people that were dealing with hardship but really wasn't their own fault, at no fault of their own, and it had 3 major points that it would help out. So it's going to help out, number one, old age people. It was that same pension that Francis Townsend wanted came through with Social Security, and so now these people could retire at a certain age and still be able to survive the rest of their lives. The next group is called survivors. What would happen is if you were dependent on someone else, so if you had a child, your child was dependent on the father, he was the one that made the money, then if the father died, the survivors would get a certain amount of money to help them continue their life on. And so if you're dependent on your father's wages and your father dies, then you get money. You and your mother would get money to keep yourself, your family going forward and not completely go poor, lose your house, all that kind of stuff. The last one is people with disabilities were also given money because they had to deal with hardships and it wasn't their fault. It's just how they were born. But the question was, all this money's got to go out. Who's going to pay for it? And so the answer is that Social Security is paid directly out of your check. So every single check, they take that Social Security right out of it. And any business that you work for has to match that amount exactly. So if you put in $100, the business has to put in $100. It doesn't matter. Whatever gets taken out automatically from your payroll also gets taken out automatically from the country, and so or from the business. And so it's a good thing, but a lot of people were mad and they said it's going to remove money from the economy because it's going to hurt the businesses. There were also changes made at this time on labor and how workers would work and how things would change there. And the first one was called the National Labor Relations Act, but most people ended up calling it just the Wagner Act. And the Wagner Act said, or it helped out unions. It said workers can be in unions, and you can't employers cannot discriminate based on unions. They can't not hire you just because you're in a union or just because you're not in a union. And so the other thing it did is it made collective bargaining legal, and collective bargaining is where your whole union or your whole group of people can come in and negotiate to get your wages to go up or your benefits to go up. And what it said is that companies actually have to participate in this collective bargaining too, not just that it could exist, but that they companies had to be a part of it as well. And so that was a big deal. Also, at this time, a new labor union was created. It was called the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO. And eventually they'd go together with the AFL, but the Congress of Industrial Organizations was a union that put together the skilled people like the AFL had and the non-skilled people like the Knights of Labor had, and put them all together to make them have more power. And in 1936, the United Auto Workers part of this union ended up doing something called a sit-down strike. And the sit-down strike, what they did is they went into the factory, went into work, punched in, and they just sat there and did nothing. And it worked really well, and they got what they wanted, but the Supreme Court would later rule that that kind of thing was illegal, so that can't happen anymore. So now we can look at the New Deal kind of after it happened and some of the arguments that were against it and some of the good things that it did. And the arguments that were against it is that it just gave too much power to the federal government. They were just taking way more power than anyone was allowed to have before, and that was a scary thing. And so what they thought is that threatens not only our individual freedoms, but also the businesses, the enterprise as well. The second thing is that they were using deficit spending to do this. So they were spending more money, the government was, than they could get in taxes. And so what happens there is your debt goes up. If you're spending more money than you're making, you have to be getting that money somewhere, and that means you have to owe somebody it. Okay. And last but not least, it's a lot of people say it didn't work and it wasn't a good thing because it just failed to end the Great Depression. The Great Depression wouldn't end because of the New Deal. It wouldn't actually end until war production in the United States started to get into the World War II in 1941, and so that's what brought us out, not the New Deal. But we also have to look at how the New Deal was successful, and the way that it was successful is it ended a lot of the problems that were happening, or at least helped some of the problems that were happening. Things like unemployment. It helped the banks. It helped the stock market bounce back. It helped the poor people to not be so poor and not be starving to death. It helped the workers to get unionized and do things like that. The second major thing that it did is it really built up our infrastructure. It built up the things that make America a good place to live, the public works like the roads and bridges and things like that, as well as the parks. And so it essentially made America a better place to live. And then the last thing that it did is it brought back the faith in our government. It said even if they can't fix the issues, they're at least going to do something and try and fix them and try and make them better for us.